I think we'll make a start. So welcome to tonight's event, The New Nationalism, The Rise of the Populist Right in the West. Just before we start, since this is the late 2010s, there is a hashtag if you want to tweet. It's hashtag popBBK. So that is going to be the hashtag for this evening's event. I'm not going to say it's pop BBK. Okay. All right. Okay. So we have three. We're very fortunate tonight to have three of what I consider to be the leading scholars on the politics of the populist right in the West. We've got going from the far end there, Matthew Goodwin, who is professor in comparative politics at the University of Kent. We have just flown in for your enjoyment from Los Angeles, Justin Guest, who is assistant professor of public policy at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government. And then we have Daphne Helikiopoulos, who is associate professor at the University of Reading. Excuse me.
Congratulations.
We're using the...
He's got a promotion.
Was a while ago. Now, Justin.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start in order, and Justin, why don't you kick things off? Oh, by the way, the format is going to be, we're going to have our presenters make their opening statements for about 7 minutes, and then we're going to have some questions and discussion amongst the presenters, and then we're going to go to you for Q&A. So think of some good questions. Justin, please, you have the floor.
Sure. Do you mind if I stand?
You can stand, you can go here, either one.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so this is definitely the equivalent of being thrown into the deep end because I literally just got off the flight from Los Angeles. So what will be fun is that I sort of see this as a sort of a BBC version of my remarks, perhaps CNN version of my remarks. So I'll be provocative and I'll be brief because I really actually am quite interested in your questions and to hear some of the banter from the stage. I want to begin with actually where I end in my book, The New Minority, which came out last year but was written for 5 years before Brexit took place, when Trump, of course, was a reality television star. The end of the book concludes that white working class people are ultimately rational. And that is really controversial, because we hear all the time, what is wrong with white working class people? Why do they vote against their own interests in driving this wave of populism and nationalism across the transatlantic space? Why don't they vote in their interests? And from my perspective, I think that they do. Now, why? They definitely vote against their economic interests when they reject parties that are trying to perhaps redistribute wealth, advocate for greater protectionism. They all, at the same time, are making the choice to vote in support of their cultural interests. And that is the way that this populism and the elections that we have been seeing are falling. The splits have been more cultural in nature than economic. And the reason that there's actually some hypocrisy, I think, in declaring that white working class people vote against their own interests is that we don't say that about people like Warren Buffett or George Soros in the United States, both of whom are billionaires and big backers of the Democratic Party, and rather left-wing. No, what we say is we say, bravo for supporting and championing and staying true to your social and cultural interests at the expense of your own economic interests, George and Warren. But yet we don't say the same thing when white working class people are effectively doing the same when they support the populist right. And a lot of this actually relates back to a sense not just of cultural anxiety and alienation, but actually a sense of deprivation of status in the societies that they once defined. Back in August of 2016, Donald Trump gave a speech in Nevada. And during the speech, he said, some of you may recall this, he said, "I love poorly educated people." And all of us said, "Oh, cringe. That's so strange. Who says that? Who would ever say something like that? It's so odd." And at the same time, who says something like that? Who has said something like that? Who has made it clear that they're making a deliberate and purportedly sincere appeal for the votes of the marginalized, for the votes of poor people? for the votes of people who are without high formal educations. That speech rang in contrast to Hillary Clinton's deplorable comments. There, she is effectively redlining a group of the population, a subgroup, and saying, you do not matter to me. And Donald Trump said, that group of people, you're welcome inside of my camp. And when you hear that as a white working class people, the rational reaction is to say, that person, however surprising and counterintuitive as it may be, that Manhattan millionaire, billionaire, we're not really sure, with the gold-plated everything, is actually more likely to support and back my own interests than the establishment figure that he's running against. And this also goes back to political parties as well, both here in the United Kingdom, in much of continental Europe, and in the United States. Political parties for generations have not known what to do with white working class people. This group that is driving a lot of the populism that we see, although not by themselves, I should make clear. Parties have treated white working class people in many ways like the ringmaster in a circus treats the tiger. You engage every so often, but make sure you keep a safe distance. And the reason is that for these political parties, particularly the center-left and the center-right, white working class people pose a problem. For Democrats and laborites, they're okay with the protectionism. No problems there. The socialist economics, that's okay. The anti-elitism, that's okay too. But the nativism, the borderline and sometimes overt racism, that's a no-go, not welcome here. And it's a problem inside of their coalition intent. For Republicans and Tories, the nativism, tolerable, especially if it's more subtle. But the protectionism and the anti-elite economics, the anti-business perspectives from their perspective, a no-go. And yet, every 4 to 5 years, these parties have had to appeal to this problematic group of people in order to get their votes. And so they stand up in front of factories that have been closed down, mines that have been shut or collapsed, and say, I will bring back your jobs. And white working class people have rolled their eyes, one after the other, as they come through like a parade, and say, here comes another one. And so, populism is a disjuncture from those politics. It is attempting a revolutionary reversal of who has power and claims to be reinstating the deserving masses into their proper place. Because at their core, they are concerned about a loss of status, of power in the societies that they once defined. This comes through statistical evidence in my book, but also through ethnographic evidence from 6-month ethnographies in Barking and Dagenham in East London, and also in Youngstown, Ohio, in the United States. And I'll conclude with just one further anecdote. Think about Donald Trump's slogan. You can also think about the Brexit slogan, right? We want our country back. Take Britain back. Donald Trump's was, of course, Make America Great Again. Remove the last word as a thought experiment. What do you have? Donald Trump, Make America Great. Every politician wants to make their country great. How is this different? By appending the word again, Donald Trump communicated implicitly that America was once great, and today, not so great anymore. And for the millions of cosmopolitans and ethnic minorities and urbanites in big cities and the coasts of the United States, this is ridiculous. How was the past great? Antiquated technologies, a closed trading space, lack of a global economy, colored drinking fountains, black people going to the back of our buses. How was the past so great? But the white working class people who I interviewed extensively in Youngstown, Ohio, when they think of the past, they think about these hulking steel mills with chimneys pumping and percolating all day, black smoke in the air. And they remember stable jobs that had good pay, They had, remember, a sense of social cohesion, a sense of dignity, a sense of centrality in their societies. And the past looks pretty great. And so, what's driving this idea here, what's driving the populism that we are seeing, is a pervasive and perhaps destructive sense of nostalgia, such that the only way to envision a post-traumatic future is to reinstate a pre-traumatic past. Thanks.
Daphne?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Eric, for inviting me. And thank you all for coming. I see some familiar faces here, so nice to see you. I am accustomed to being the only woman in the panel. This always happens to me, so yeah,
You haven't asked Matt his pronouns.
So I have 7 minutes. I might go slightly over. I have some notes, so I won't stand. I want to make two points here to you today, and then pick them or unpack them more in the questions. But I want to first start with a disclaimer. Be a bit provocative, as this is the way we started. So the rise of the populist right in the West, this was the title of the panel. I have a small problem with the term populism. I find it very problematic and difficult to use, precisely because it seems to be used more as a normative thing than an analytical thing. It seems to me that we are lumping in all sorts of parties or movements that we don't like and calling them populism. But from an analytical perspective, it's difficult to define because there isn't really anything that is the opposite to populism. It's very difficult to find something that isn't populism. In a democracy, what party, after all, doesn't talk about the people? What party doesn't try to mobilize the people? So I'd like to specify that what I'm talking about here today is far-right parties or groups that emphasize immigration, emphasize sovereignty, and put forward what we call the national preference in their policies, i.e. either sole or priority access to for native groups of welfare, of job provisions, etc. So this is what I will be focusing on today. We've seen this happen all across Europe with the AFD recently, the PVV in the Netherlands, the Golden Dawn in Greece, the FPO in Austria, and possibly Brexit and Trump, though I am reluctant to put all these things in the same category, as I said. So my argument, it's increasingly the consensus in the literature that the reason why this is happening is because of some sort of a cultural grievance. So there is this idea that there is a transnational cleavage emerging, which is a sort of a post-material cleavage that is pitting people pro-cosmopolitanism and against those who are pro-cosmopolitanism and those who are against. So it is people who are fearing the loss of their cultural identity. It is a perceived incompatibility between cultures, and it is a perceived inability of certain groups to assimilate that is driving this phenomenon. And I would like to disagree with this proposition here today and make 2 points. I've been invited to many talks, and I've made points from previous research about the role of actually labour market institutions and policies and how they seem to mediate far-right party support. But this is not what I will do today. My argument essentially is that there is very little that is both new and nationalism related in the demand for these parties. It is actually the supply that is nationalistic. The demand for these parties is driven more by actually economic grievances. And as I said, I've argued elsewhere for policies, but today I want to make my 2 points on immigration. And I want to make a point on immigration that is comparative from work I've carried out of using European social survey data from 2014 across Europe. And then I also want to talk about a specific project that I did on Greece, so use an example of a country that has experienced severe economic crisis. So with regards to the immigration question, the idea is, or what people usually say is, okay, so immigration is a driver for far-right party support, therefore far-right party support is driven by cultural considerations. However, if we actually look at immigration attitudes or anti-immigration attitudes, we will see that they themselves are driven not only by cultural concerns, but also by economic concerns. There are many people who vote who are anti-immigrant because they fear for their job, for their economic position, they fear that the position in the labour market will deteriorate, etc. We looked at that with, I have some data that I could show you, but I'm not showing you. We looked at that with my colleague Tim Landers, looking at European social survey data, and we found indeed that there are more people worried about the economic impact of immigration than there are people worried about the cultural impact of immigration. And if we look at, so actually what we're saying is that whereas there is a stronger propensity for those, so those worried about culture are more likely to vote for the far right, but they are numerically fewer. They are fewer people that actually are worried about culture. Therefore, in the countries that have high far-right party support, i.e. more than 7%, what is going on is that these parties are able to mobilize those who are worried about the economy. Whereas the countries that have low far-right party support are only mobilizing those worried about culture. So in order to be successful, a far-right party needs to go beyond the cultural, those worried about culture, they need to try and mobilize those worried about the economy. So I think economic insecurity is something very important that drives anti-immigration attitudes that in turn drive far-right party support. So that's my first point. And very briefly, my supply point, that was my demand point across Europe. Very briefly, my supply point. Now, within this context of the transnational cleavage, what we're actually witnessing is far-right parties going beyond the immigration in their supply. So they're trying to mobilize voters on many issues. They offer what we call nationalist solution, not only to immigration, but actually to many economic problems. And so this, we argue, in another project I've done with my colleague Sofia Vassilopoulou, is because of actually they're trying to address voters' economic insecurity. Now, we did a project on Greece, and I'm telling you this today because Greece is an interesting case because of the severe economic crisis that it has witnessed. And we looked at the extent to which the Golden Dawn, the far-right party in Greece, its entry in the party system has influenced the policies of the salience of policies of the other parties in the system. And we found the following. The Golden Dawn does not refer to immigration very much. In fact, immigration is not one of the three most salient issues for the Golden Dawn. The other parties in the system also don't have immigration as the most salient issue. But instead what has happened is that the Golden Dawn is increasingly framing its other policy areas, especially the economy, in a nationalistic manner. So they're using a nationalist framing to justify their economic policies. And again, I have data that I could have shown you. And again, we can see that what is going on after the entry of the party in the system, the other parties have also adopted an increasingly nationalistic narrative to justify not their anti-immigration position, but all their positions. So just to very briefly conclude, why am I telling you this? Because I want to get across that I believe the economy is still very important within the context of the transnational cleavage. And I've tried to tell you this today, focusing on both the demand, but also the supply with regards to political parties. So I think that in terms of what drives the vote, it's not new and it's not nationalism. But the supply, the parties themselves, they are definitely adopting a more nationalistic narrative. Thank you.
Thanks, Daphne. Okay, well, I'll turn it over to Matt Goodwin to round things up.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you for coming along. The debate, and it's great to have everyone here. I'm just going to stand down here. So Martin Wolf in the Financial Times the other day said that all populism, Trump, Brexit, parties in Central and Eastern Europe can be traced back to the financial crisis, to the decline of manufacturing jobs, to the rise of China, and to essentially the Great Recession. And if you just fast forward, so imagine we were having this debate a year from now, we'll have gone through the elections in Sweden, Italy and Hungary, and just take those examples. So Sweden has seen the populist right Sweden Democrats go from 3% to between 20 and 25% in one of the strongest economies in Europe. In fact, actually, if you just go a bit south and look at the Netherlands, when I started doing my PhD in 2003, the Netherlands was always, well, the Netherlands and Austria were held up as, and actually the Netherlands, Sweden and Britain were held up as cases that should not have had populist parties because of their historic tradition of tolerance and liberalism and the first past the post system and all the rest of it. But actually, if you look at where we are now, and you said to me then, look, Matt, actually UK is going to vote for Brexit, Sweden is going to have a populist right party in over 20%, and the Netherlands is going to have a fragmenting party system with Pim Fortuyn followed by Geert Wilders, I probably would have laughed you out of town. But if you also look at, just compare that Swedish case with Austria, there you have two of the most dynamic, strong, resilient economies in Western Europe with two of the most successful populist parties currently in Europe. And also, if you look at the research since the crisis, it suggests that not only regions that were hit the weakest by the financial crisis tended to give higher levels of support to the populist right, but also more generally, these parties enjoyed much of their growth before the collapse of the Lehman Brothers. You begin to understand why the kind of economist FT line of thinking on this isn't really accurate. And that raises the obvious question of why and what's going on. And I guess my headline point, because I like to be provocative, is that firstly, none of this is going away. Okay, the broad point is, guys in the city always say, are we at the beginning of a period of political volatility or are we at the end? We're at the beginning. We're at the beginning. And the reason I say that is because for the first time in 2 or 3 decades, particular social groups have realised they now have a greater sense of agency in the political system. 1978, Ronald Inglehart wrote The Silent Revolution, and he talked about the rise of the New Left and essentially liberal progressives that shared the liberal consensus on pro-EU membership, pro-immigration, transnational organisations. Let's get this liberal show on the road. The counter-revolution to that, which Piero Ignazi first talked about in his article in 1992, has now arrived, which is that we've seen a realignment in politics, production workers, skilled, semi-skilled workers moving over to the populist right, joined with middle-class conservatives, authoritarians, and they put together a pretty compelling and significant coalition of supporters and have lined up behind these parties in a much bigger way than they did previously. And that is largely because of ethnic change and immigration. In Western democracies are now experiencing very rapid churn over a short period of time, and people have realised that this value divide now is really on. And that side that once upon a time flocked behind Tony Blair and Gerhard Schroeder and the Green parties and the radical left was used to having a really big stake in the political system. Well, now actually the groups that Justin's been talking about, and his book, by the way, is excellent at pointing to this, groups that have felt that they're left behind not only economically, but politically. Only this week in Britain we had a study that showed if you went to the Clarendon private schools, you are 94 times more likely to be in Who's Who than if you didn't go to those schools. I mean, it's genuinely no wonder that certain social groups are sat here thinking, I have no stake in this political system whatsoever. And you can look at the US Congress as saying the same dynamic. Political inequality is the big debate, and certain groups have felt, I think my own view is justifiably, that they don't have a stake in this political system. And we looked at this in Revolt on the Right. Just before Brexit, the proportion of working class voters in Britain who said, people like me have no say in government, reached its highest share on record, about 1 in 2. And then we sort of sit around over the last 16 months having a debate about what led to Brexit, and we say, well, how come everybody voted for it? Because they don't feel like they have a voice in this political system. And the populist right has pulled those groups into politics and given them a much greater sense of agency. And so I think now that this conflict is on and certain groups are mobilising, and this is really going to rumble on, certainly for my lifetime. The question is, what do you do about it, and how do you respond to it, and how do we get around the polarisation, that is now erupting across most, if not all, Western democracies? And I guess there is a silver lining in all of this, which is that groups that weren't participating in politics are now participating in politics. If you look at Germany, the second strongest source of support for the AfD were non-voters, people who had given up on politics long ago. If you look at Brexit, the reason the telephone polls were wrong on Brexit was because around 2.5 million, mainly working class white voters, turned up at the polls and voted for Brexit, and they'd been ignoring pollsters up until that point. About 60% of those that didn't vote in 2015 turned out at the referendum and voted for Brexit. These voters are coming back into the political system in a big way. The question is, how do liberals and progressives respond to that? Well, one obvious way forward is not to kind of laugh and condemn and dismiss those voters back out of the political system, but to take their concerns fairly seriously. And Social Democrats have refused to do that, and that's why I genuinely have very little sympathy for Social Democrats, because 1995 was the first election year when Jean-Marie Le Pen became the most popular politician among working class voters. 22 years later, if you have not revived your ideological formula, if you have genuinely not got the message that you have a fundamental problem connecting with workers, then I'm not going to have much sympathy for the French socialists getting knocked out of the party system, the German Social Democrats having their worst results since 1933, the Austrian centre-left getting knocked out of power. I'll put money on the Italian centre-left losing the election in March. Because social democracy as an ideological project has completely failed to adapt to an era in which identity politics is dominant. And if it doesn't adapt, it will be replaced by radical left parties, by radical right parties. So unless these traditional mainstream parties adapt, they've got big problems. And Jeremy Corbyn partly is an answer, in that he's revived mass democracy. If you've read Peter Mayer's Ruling the Void, people like Jeremy Corbyn shouldn't happen. Peter Mayer argued that parties were turning in on the state, they were becoming more centrist, they were turning into technocratic entities that had no connection to grassroots democracy. Corbyn actually is an interesting outlier in social democracy, in that he's revived mass democracy. He's got the second largest political party in Europe in terms of members. But he's not really dealing with the identity politics issue that is rumbling underneath the surface of debates. June was the best election for the Conservative Party among the working class in history. That is not the adequate response of social democracy to this dilemma. It's just lost a massive constituency to the centre-right, which has effectively become UKIP light. So I think there are massive questions. I think running through all of this, and I'll be quiet because I know Eric usually tells me to be quiet, stop talking. But the big question, the big kind of point running through all of this is, because so much of this is deep-rooted and wrapped up in values and wrapped up in new social groups that are, for the first time often, getting politically active, it's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. And I'm bored to tears of reading Janan Ganesh and Jeremy Cliff telling me that this is a phenomenon of the angry old white man. I mean, really, French presidential election, Marine Le Pen, strongest among the under 40s. Austrian national election, young Austrian men without degrees. Law and justice in Poland, incredibly strong among 18 to 30-year-olds. The list goes on and on and on. These are voters that are being socialised in a Europe where voting for the populist right is increasingly acceptable. Right? I mean, if you're 35 in France, which is the average age of a Le Pen voter, you grew up in a household, in a country, where voting for Le Pen was a pretty common thing. I mean, it's not taboo. It's not a kind of, it's not a kind of Europe in the 1960s. So we're looking at generations of voters, my students included, who have grown up during Brexit, that for them, this whole experience of European politics is, populism is pretty normal, which is why I don't think any of this, again, is going anywhere soon.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
So we've got about 10 or 15 minutes, or 10 minutes or so for you guys to sort of have a go at each other. Or I could sort of drop a question in. I mean, one thing, maybe I'll just drop a question in about media because I know I didn't.
I'm actually quite happy to have a go.
Yeah,
Oh,
me
all
too.
right, okay,
I'd like
all
to
right.
have a
In
go
that
too.
case, why don't you guys go to it then?
So the truth is that I think that both Matt on my far right and Daphne on my left are actually both right and they're both wrong. And they actually represent pillars of what we're hearing in society today. There are two sides that one side wants to make you think that it's all about economics, and we'll just call that the sort of Daphne, Martin Wolf, Brussels perspective. Okay? And I'll explain Brussels in a second.
Not what I argue.
The other side wants to make this about culture, and we'll call that the Matt Goodwin, Tyler Cowen perspective, because Tyler actually wrote a very interesting piece for, he's an economist at George Mason University, who wrote a very good piece for Bloomberg about a week ago, actually, that cited a few of the data bits that Matt kindly shared. And here's why they're both right and they're both wrong. So starting with this idea that it's purely culture and there's no economics involved, it's not sufficient to say that just because you've had economic growth and economic success, that a country is economically well off. There is a pollster named Celinda Lake who focuses on working class politics in the United States. She did a focus group on Clinton, about Bill Clinton in the 1990s. And she was in a focus group in Los Angeles, my hometown. And she said to these voters who were not very interested in Bill Clinton, she said, Bill Clinton just created 1 million jobs. Isn't that great, guys? Aren't you excited about that? And a woman raised her hand and said, yeah, I got 3 of them, and they all suck. The problem is that the growth that we see in aggregate is not actually reaching the people, and that the jobs that are being created, that they're keeping the employment rate down low, are precarious and often insufficient to really live well. And for many of the people who hold those jobs or who have left the economy or are taking in benefits, for them, the recession did not begin in 2007 like it did for many of us. Their recession began in 1977 in Youngstown, Ohio on September 19th when the first factory there shut its doors, locking its employees out. Okay? The other factor, and the reason why we can't deny the role of economics here, is that the parties, the center-left and center-right in Europe and the United States, and especially Britain and the United States, in the early 1990s made a strategic choice. They were going to ditch the socialist economics and embrace global neoliberalism. They're going to do this at the expense of their union bases. And I'm not saying this is wrong. It was strategic. They saw the way the world was going. They needed to fundraise in the United States. They needed to change things up after an entire decade and a half of losing to Thatcher and Reagan. And so, in the United States, you had the Democratic Leadership Council, which produced Bill Clinton, and you had Tony Blair come out of the British system in creating a third way of politics, as it was called. That third way led the left to converge with the right in the embrace of neoliberalism. Suddenly, what if you are a white working class person? What separates the two mainstream parties economically? Less. Maybe not nothing, but less than it used to be. And what separated them more prominently was their differences in culture. The left became a party less of economic justice and more of social and racial justice. And the right represented their antithesis. Now, here's why Matt, I think, actually makes very good points, though, and why I don't think we can go with this Brussels Martin Wolf perspective that Daphne was sharing. And I say Brussels because every time I go to Brussels and I give a talk about the new minority, there's always a question in the crowd that says, Justin, Justin. That's my name in French. Why does this have to be about race? Why white people? Why does it matter that they're white? Why does it matter that they're angry about Muslims? Why does it matter that they're concerned about black people or Latinos in the United States? Why, Justin? Why do you make it about race? Precisely because my subjects make it about race. Race is an ever-present reality, whether it is latent and implicit or overt and crass, in the realities of people who are seeing the complexion, literally and figuratively, of their countries changing. And so we must acknowledge these differences. And if you don't believe me, read the data. Matt has produced excellent data. Rob Ford has studied this extensively and demonstrated that the wedge issue tends to be racial resentment and immigration. In the United States, John Sides from George Washington University, across the river from my university, is about to publish a very good book. He's already published a report that shows that the principal difference between people who were supporting Obama in the two general elections in 2008 and 12 and switched their votes to Trump in 2016, what defines this group of people is that they have previously, even when they voted for Obama, held strong views that are typically associated with racial resentment, want to deport the undocumented, which obviously is a bigger issue in the United States than it is over here. And so we cannot deny the role that race has as it relates to immigration. Of course, there's a sense of economic threat with immigration. But we have to acknowledge social desirability bias, which is a fancy way of social scientists saying people lie. And just like the Brussels bureaucrats are uncomfortable with discussing race, because it is uncomfortable, it's not a fun topic to discuss, so are the respondents to polls. And they will shield and veil their racial sense of disorientation, their cultural sense of disorientation and status loss by referring to economics. And so we cannot deny the fact that economics and culture are inextricably intertwined in the politics of populism and this new nationalism.
Okay, Jess, thanks.
Can I?
Yeah, Daphne, do you want to?
Thank you. Yeah, first I would like to clarify that I did not say it's only the economy and nothing else matters, and I'm surprised people think I said that. What I wanted to get
People
across...
don't think it was me. It was me.
It was you. What I was trying to get across is that I think that the simply predominantly it's only culture is an oversimplification. And there are two reasons for this, so I want to directly actually respond to your to Matt's point. The first point was partially covered by Justin, where you said, yes, look, in the Netherlands, the economy was doing really well, yet they had no far right. In Spain, the economy is doing really poorly, I'm saying that, and they have, in Netherlands, they have far right. In Spain, the economy is doing really poorly, and they don't have far right. Absolutely. We have measures like growth, we have measures like unemployment, and they do not correlate with far right party support, and that is very true. But I have written elsewhere, the economy is not only about that. Firstly, people, when I say economic insecurity, people immediately think, oh, it's the precariat, the lower classes, the absolutely, the what? No, it's economic insecurity affects everybody. Economic insecurity affects, first and foremost, the large middle class that feels that they are worse off. And there are, when you have a sort of an economic crisis or economic malaise, it is actually certain policies, and very much labor market policies and economic policies that mitigate the effect of the crisis. So it's not about the economy per se, but it's about the extent to which certain policies mitigate the risks that are posed by certain economic problems. So we found, for example, in our work that countries with good, properly well-regulating employment protection legislation tend to have lower far-right party support, because when economic insecurity hits, people feel that they are less at risk. Or even unemployment benefits tend to mitigate the impact of unemployment on far-right party support. So I think it is fair to say that different social groups respond differently, and that obviously economic insecurity is not something that affects only the lower classes. This is my first point. My second point is, okay, we say, sure, we make a statement, whatever statement, right? It is culture that is causing the rise of the far right. And I'm going to say to you, if you say that to me, well, how do you know? And the people who argue this say, we know because the cultural indicators, what we have as cultural indicators, correlate with far right party support. Look, immigration correlates with far right party support. Look, Engelhardt and Norris, in their otherwise very, very indeed interesting piece, say trust in institutions is a cultural variable. Why? Why is immigration necessarily a cultural variable when we know that it's not only cultural insecurities that drive immigration attitudes. Why is trust in institutions a cultural variable? Isn't it again very much related to policies? Isn't it again very, very much related to the way that governments and states mitigate the impact of certain insecurities on the people? Isn't that trust in institutions? Why is it a cultural thing necessarily? And obviously it's not a static thing. So we found, again, we did a lot of work on this using this whole social contract idea, and we found again that in Greece, with economic crisis, trust in institutions declined dramatically. Trust in the parliament, trust in the state, trust in the political parties and the elite. So what I'm saying here is I don't see why those indicators are necessarily cultural. This is not to say that culture doesn't play a role. I think culture plays a role, but I think that other factors beyond culture also play a role. And just lastly, you spoke, Justin, about race, but what is an interesting thing that is happening across Europe is that the far-right parties that are more successful in Europe, bar the Golden Dawn, which I find an exception, is those that distance themselves from race. It is those that actually say, clearly, we are not racist. I'm not saying they're not. I'm saying this is the narrative they put forward. They are putting forward a narrative that tries to exclude people on the basis of their ideology and not on the basis of their race. We're saying, no, we don't want those people to be outsiders because, I don't know, they're of different racial background. We don't want them as part of our state, as a part of our nation, because they are ideologically hostile to us, because they are extremists, because they do not espouse our liberal democratic ideals. So I don't know to what extent these successful parties are mobilizing.
But
on
that's
race.
naive, right? I mean, that's so naive. It just so happens
For
that
who?
because it just for you in this case, because it just so happens that the people who espouse these anti-liberal views are all brown.
But that's not the point. The point
No, but it
is
is
that
the
they
point,
are
I think.
legitimating themselves. So the point is that it's about the voter is more likely to vote for a party that isn't blatantly saying we're racist.
Yes, because it's more comforting that they're not blatantly racist,
Yeah.
that they're just subtly racist
Exactly.
and tastefully racist.
But the question here
and-
isn't whether they are genuinely racist or not.
No, the question is whether race factors in. And if we acknowledge that they are subtly and latently racist, then race factors in. And it's undeniable. And so to try to whitewash it by saying, oh, it's ideological, denies the obvious racial resentment that's actually underpinning this attack against Muslims. And it is precisely actually what unites all of these far-right parties. One thing that they all, and I agree with you that they're diverse, but one thing they can all agree upon, kind of like Republicans with taxes, is that they really don't like Muslims. And they don't want Islam in their countries. I mean, that is the one thing that that makes all of the far-right get along.
Now, it's interesting because Daphne made, I think, an additional point on that, which was this idea of presenting themselves as not being racist is
Exactly.
helping the parties actually. And I think that kind of brings up a point, which I don't know what you guys think, but this idea of toxicity of parties, so that, I want to vote for these parties, but I don't want to be thinking myself as a racist, so, which is what you're
That's
getting
exactly what I'm trying to say.
in the presentation. Matt, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, Germany is the obvious example. So, I mean, if you'd said to me in 2000 that Germany would have an overtly radical right party and with 13% of the vote and over 90 seats in Parliament, I would have said, well, it's impossible, because the whole literature at that point told us that social norms against this stuff are very strong, and that's explains sort of, Sweden's history of liberalism. And I mean, Britain was always known in the literature in the 90s and early 2000s as what was called the exceptional case, which was a country that was immune to populism. And you just saw how easily UKIP broke through and became, in relative terms, the most working class electorate in British politics, more so than Labour, forced a referendum, and boom, there you go. I think the idea that there's potential for populism in every Western democracy, I mean, there are very few academics, serious academics, that would disagree with that. I mean, even Spain is now lining up in a very interesting way, I think, for an anti-EU, anti-establishment party. But I really disagree with this idea that ultimately this is just about economics, and there are lots of reasons why I disagree with it. I think it's a comfortable argument, line of thinking. I think it goes with the sort of liberal view that tends to kind of come with working in higher education and politics and media, that this is ultimately about ensuring that resources are distributed fairly and so on. And there is an element of that. There's no doubt there is an element of that. Justin's brought it out in his book. We showed ahead of the referendum in Britain, if you felt that you'd been economically left behind, you were far more likely than other voters to play down the risks of Brexit. So it was working in a sort of backroom calculation among voters. I mean, it's a bit like Justin said, the Remain camp threw everything at this argument that, God, it's in your economic interest to stay in the EU. And,
And it was in their economic interest.
Well, a few million voters were saying, hey, this economy hasn't been working for me for 30 years.
Yeah.
Why am I going to believe you now that actually EU membership's good for me? Or you guys are selling me as a vision of never-ending change. I don't want never-ending change. My status is under threat. My group is under threat. And I'm going to respond accordingly. And interestingly, the areas that gave the strongest support for leave, were areas, they weren't all white areas that had little experience with migration. This was a myth that certain sections of the media perpetuated because it was comfortable. The areas that gave the strongest levels of support for leave, and if you want the evidence, see my paper with Oliver Heath, were areas that had experienced rapid ethnic change over the 10 years before the vote. So on the one hand, you had more ethnically diverse areas that were overwhelmingly pro-Remain, lots of London areas, lots of big cities, but areas that had experienced rapid ethnic change over the preceding 10 years were off the charts for Brexit. And that's backed up in work on Trump, looking at counties that had a sudden influx of Hispanic Latino voters. Don Green has done work on this. Dan Hopkins has done work on this. And I think the sudden change element is important because it takes us into a tricky debate about where Western democracies are going as they become more ethnically diverse, as they become more culturally and religiously diverse, that it takes us into a very diffuse and awkward discussion about what those disrupted norms, traditions, ways of life, communities will mean for people and how they will respond to that. And in certain communities, voters decided that actually they were going to respond by supporting a political outcome, a radical political option, disrupt the status quo, because it was the only thing that was available to them at that particular time. And I keep coming back to this point. I'm sort of, I keep saying it to friends in the Labour Party. You've got to get real on this, because this is only going to escalate. And if you're going to sit and say, actually, we aren't going to deal with the identity axis, we aren't going to deal with identity politics, it's all about resources, it's all about the housing crisis, you're going to get blown away, like the Social Democrats did in many other parts of Western Europe.
Yep.
It's going to escalate, and unfortunately, they're going to have to start meeting these concerns head on.